In this question, it is mentioned a ER model. Suppose R is many to one relationship set from entity set E1 to entity set E2. Assume that E1 and E2 participate totally. Means there is a total participation between entity set E1 and E2. And what is mentioned? The cardinality of E1 is greater than the cardinality of E2. Which one of the following is true about the R? Option A, every entity in E1 is associated with exactly one entity in E2. Option B is saying some entity in E1 is associated with more than one entity in E2. Option C, every entity in E2 is associated with exactly one entity in E1. Option D, every entity in E2 is associated with at most one entity in E1. So my dear student, first of all, whatever is given we make according to that. There is a two entity set E1 and E2. Mention we have a two entity set E1 and E2, my dear student. And there is one relationship set, that is total participation and many to one. Many to one, my dear. It is mentioned there is a total participation at both side. And what is mentioned? Many to one, my dear. This side many and this side one. It is clear? This side many and this side one. It is mentioned E1 and E2 there is a many to one and total participation. And the cardinality of E1 is greater than the cardinality of E2. It is mentioned cardinality of E1 is greater than cardinality of E2, my dear. Cardinality of E2. Entity set mean to say, what is saying, my dear student? It means we have a one entity set E1 and another entity set E2. Okay. Here we have, let us assume A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, A6. Here we can have X1, X2, X3. Clear? And it is what? Many to one. It is what, beta? Many to one means many entities are associated with one entity. You can make in this, because there is a total participation at both end. There is a total participation in both end. So means each entity of entity set E1 and each entity of entity set E2 participate in the relation. And the cardinality of E1 is greater than cardinality of E2. You can take this example for that. Now read each and every option. Every entity in E1 is associated with exactly one entity in E2. Yes, my dear student. A, if I'm talking about option A, if I'm talking about option A, that is correct. Why? Because here every entity of E1, here every entity of E1 is associated with exactly one entity. Exactly one entity in E2. Why? Why? Because its total participation and many to one, many to one from E1 to E2, my dear. That's why option A is correct. That's why option A is correct. Now option B. Some entity in E1. Some entity in E1 is associated with more than one entity in E2. Option B, whenever we are talking about option B, my dear, option B is incorrect. Why? Because it is mentioned some entities. Some entities. Because mention some entities. It is mentioned some entity in E1. In E1, because it is mentioned some entity in E1, but here total participation. Here total participation, and it is mentioned more than one entity in E2, and mention more than one entity in E2. But here many to one. But here many to one. One at E2 side. Clear? That's why it is completely incorrect. Now we will see option C. Option C is saying, option C, every entity in E2 is associated with exactly one entity in E1. Every entity in E2 is exactly one entity with E1. This is incorrect. This is also incorrect because there is a many to one from E1 to E2, not from E2 to not from E2 to E1. According to this sentence, it is saying every entity in E2 means associated with exactly one entity. But what is mentioned, beta? Here it is mentioned many to one. So here it will be every entity in E1 is associated with one entity. It is one many to one, not one to many. That's why C is also wrong. D is saying every entity in E2 is associated with at most one entity. Again, this is a incorrect. D is also incorrect, my dear. Why D is incorrect? Again, I am saying same, because there is a many to one from E1 to E2, not from E2 to E1. It is saying every entity in E2 is associated with at most one entity. Mean to say from E2 it is saying. But what is happening actually? Here what is happening, my dear student? Here every entity of E1 is associated with at most, not at most exactly, because it is a total participation. So every entity of E1 is associated with exactly one entity of E2, my dear, because it is a many to one participation from E1 to E2, my dear. So what we can say, A is the correct answer for this question, my dear. A is the correct answer for this question, because it is according to the given data, it is mentioned from E1 to E2 there is a many to one and both side total participation, and the cardinality of E1 is greater than the cardinality of E2. So every entity in E1 is associated with exactly one entity in E2. So A is the correct answer. Hope so you get it. Thank you everyone.